keel over.
Welcome. I'm Clare Moody, your Police and Crime Commissioner for Avon and Somerset. Every month we hold a broadcast where I invite the Chief Constable to answer questions on the performance of Avon and Somerset Police and what is being done to address the public's key concerns about policing in our area. This month we will be addressing the subject of victims. Most topics we discuss at PQT cover victims in some form, but I wanted to place a specific focus on this subject in this PQT. Priority 4 of my police and crime plan is to support victims, to ensure they get the help they need when they need it. And as PCC, an important part of my role is to champion and be the voice for victims. So, now let me welcome Chief Constable Sarah Crewe.
Hi.
Thanks. Thank you for joining me today. Before we get into the actual subject area very specifically, one of the things I want to recognise is that a number of people prefer to think of themselves as survivors rather than victims. But I think we will use the term victims in this episode of PQT, specifically because it's the legal terminology that's used, and it's used in law, and it is also about the specific rights that are given to victims that are underpinned by law. So for the purposes of this afternoon, exactly that, I will be using the term victims. And moving to the first set of questions, it's focusing on support for victims. There is, as I mentioned, a legal underpinning for that, for the rights for victims. It's called the Victims Code of Practice, and it's a national code that sets out a minimum set of standards of service that must be provided to victims by both the police and the criminal justice system. So I've highlighted this code in my plan. I know it's, the code also brings duties onto the police as well. So do you have processes in place, Sarah, to ensure that victims' rights are upheld?
Yes, we do. As you say, it's underpinned by law, Victims Code of Practice, or VCOP, as we say in the police. And their rights and entitlements, and we do monitor and report on those. We have a performance and insights team who put together our performance management information. They use the Ministry of Justice of guidance methodology that we have. It is being finalised, but what we have, we use that. It covers areas like timeliness of contact, 5 days, 28 days, outcome rates, victims' personal statements, that's a right and entitlement, and how often we complete those. Things like accuracy of our crime recording. That information, that performance information, feeds into what we call our Investigative Standards Forum. That's chaired by an Assistant Chief Constable. And those findings are properly scrutinised at a directorate, moving down to a department and a team level. And the directorate heads, so in the meeting, are really accountable and held responsible for their performance within their teams, and they've got their own performance meetings that they take those findings back into to drive up performance. Now, within the code, there are special entitlements or rights for those victims, which are called enhanced victims. So there's a definition there, victims of serious crimes, so those may be crimes such as rape or domestic abuse, or victims who are persistently targeted over a period of time, or victims who are vulnerable and intimidated. Now, people might be vulnerable by reason of age, but also vulnerable by reason of circumstances. Now, they're offered, as I say, more different entitlements or more enhanced entitlements like quicker updates or more consistent support or access to specialist support, and sometimes all the way through the criminal justice process from beginning to end. We hold particularly detailed information about how we're complying with those victims, as you'd expect, and within that there are some extra objectives and targets that your office commissioner have set for us. So in both levels there's detailed processes. I mean, you also asked a question about training. So all officers, all staff receive training on the Victims Code of Practice through their foundation training. Victims, and those are officers, when I say staff, I mean staff who are involved in the criminal investigation process. So those are through those courses, the Police Constable Degree Apprenticeship, the Degree Entry Holder Programme at the University of West of England, and then they become a golden thread, much like the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, through all bits of training that officers and staff, the relevant staff, do. Those people, though, who are working with enhanced victims, so I'm talking specifically about the victim and witness care officers, who are the single point of contact for those victims.
How to check compliance,
Yeah.
how to check that officers and staff are really responding to victims, and some of that can be picked by data, some of it's experiential.
Yeah.
How do you really sort of dig, just to dig into that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking here about victim surveys and the victim's voice. So we do regular, and have for many years, victim surveys, which ask people, as any survey, about their experience of the police. And that can go from first point of contact, ease of contact and how it was, right through to how satisfied they were with the outcome of their case. So those surveys would focus on communication, how they felt they were treated, whether they felt listened to, respected, a really important theme through our work on rape in particular, or Operation Bluestone, but also whether they were kept informed at regular intervals, at the intervals they felt was appropriate throughout the case. Now, the satisfaction cover a range of offences, so we do regular satisfaction surveys on burglary, on violent crime, on hate crime, on antisocial behaviour. So I'd say those are high volume crimes. But we also do, as I've said, a Soteria, which is the national name for Bluestone, rape victim survey. And those enhanced victims within Lighthouse surveys them to see how their service has been. So I'd say those are high impact cases. So we have a range of different victim types which we survey, and that data, that insight, this is more insight, feeds into those performance frameworks as well. And some of that can be verbatim comments that can filter down to the individual officer so they know what impact they had. We've also got our feedback option on our website, so people who've experienced our service can say whether it was good, poor, and give us some feedback. And again, that feeds into those networks. And you know, there are more qualitative ways that we listen to victims as well. So, and I could give numerous examples, but a couple of good ones. For domestic abuse victims, and I'm going to use the word survivor because they're called survivor forums in this. We do have survivor forums. So, for instance, those voices have been critical in helping us shape a conference that we've got later in the year. But a more practical way would be we have a big training programme called Domestic Abuse Matters for all staff that deal with domestic abuse. There is a pre-input. And that has been put together by victims of domestic abuse, explaining how it feels for them to navigate police systems and the impact of the contact, just as you said. Yeah. So that feeds into training. And I'd say there are other ways. So we, as a result of Operation Bluestone, actually, we hold what we call NFA scrutiny panels. NFA means no further action. And these are cases that have been filed and are not going to prosecution. But we sit down with CPS lawyers, police, but critically independent sexual violence advisors or independent domestic abuse, domestic violence advisors, IDVAs, and they represent the voice of the victim in those forums. And there's been huge learning. Those panels look at sexual offences, they look at domestic abuse, they look at stalking and harassment. I mean, some cases actually get reopened as a result of those. but more often we get real learning about how we've acted in a way that has either increased the confidence of the victim or undermined it.
Yeah.
So hugely valuable. So the last thing I'd say on that, we recognise that there's more that we can do with the new Victims Code of Practice. So we are developing a new victims voice survey. And rather than particular crime types, this will ask all victims who have reported a crime. They'll be sent a link. In the electronic age that we have, it will invite them to complete an online form, and that will be brought back to us in the form of an app, which means that we can scrutinise the performance at a global level, but again, get information down to the individual officers that have dealt with those cases. And we'll bring that together actually with all of our victims' information into one place, because we have people who report police complaints, not just crimes, but they make complaints. We also have victims' experience of very specific bits of the process. So when we say a case is going no further, victims have a chance to write to review. That's part of the Victims Code of Practice. We want to specifically understand people's experiences of the victim's right to review process. So we're trying to bring everything together in one point to get a real understanding, which would be hugely valuable for Priority 4, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that actually is a really important point. You rightly pointed out the specific response there has been, you know, that in-depth work that was done initially through Project Bluestone and now in the national operating model, Operation Soteria around rape and serious sexual offences. And there are specific needs for victims of specific crime types. But then with that deep learning that went through the now Operation Soteria work, have you found that has given you general learning as well about how to respond to victims, you know, as well as that very clear specific learning?
Yes, and that's an ongoing process, but I'd say in two areas. One is this concept of procedural justice. People need to feel treated with respect, listened to. They need to feel that they're getting an appropriate outcome as well, so how well we do with whatever they're bringing to us, but feeling that they have agency and power in the process. So procedural justice, incredibly important, and it's driven up confidence on rape, but that is in the that has to be throughout our whole delivery of victim support, and also becoming more trauma informed. So understanding the trauma people might bring into the process of reporting into interacting with the police, but also the importance of how we interact with them to avoid re-traumatisation. So those are two aspects that Soteria Bluestone has opened up for us that we actually need to draw into our whole delivery of victim support.
Thank you. And we have also touched on the fact that this is the Victims Code of Practice. It's absolutely about police's response, but it is also about the wider criminal justice response. And you know, we are looking at establishing, we've got a local criminal justice board meeting this week, tomorrow. And as chair of that, I'm bringing to that meeting Victims Code of Practice, establishing a Victims Code of Practice group as well. So that other criminal justice partners are also picking up on this issue and responding to those needs.
Absolutely. I mean, we are the most visible part of the criminal justice system, but you're absolutely right. It's the experience of the whole that's important and will impact on victim confidence.
Yeah, and it is, you know, commissioning victim services as I do, and you know, again, perhaps as the most stark example of this, the rape and serious victim survivors of rape and serious sexual offences, we know there are delays in the court system.
Yes.
And so the support that victims get is essential to them.
Absolutely, and all the different aspects of the criminal justice system will be holding that victim throughout that extended period of time. So it's critically important we get it right at each stage. And we're very cognizant of the workloads that are there as well. And then there's this issue of vicarious trauma, I think, for those that are working with victims consistently and living their cases and their experience of the system as well. So that trauma informed is something we're alive to for our own staff as well.
Yeah, very, very important. And it is, I should say as well as the commissioning work that I do as Police and Crime Commissioner, that we have just recommissioned service support for victims, and it was very important in that process to have the voice of victims informing the commissioning that was done, so that it runs as a sort of golden thread through the work that, through my office's work, but also the work of scrutiny and your work with victims. So when we're looking, just building on this a bit, there's also, there's clearly the support that is commissioned to, for victims to engage with. But the victims' needs assessment that we undertook in that commissioning process was looking at how to support victims understanding the criminal justice system that they are going to go through. And how does that work from your, from the point of view of investigators and your officers when they are working with victims as well?
Okay, so there's two levels really. The first is the officers and the investigators first, and then if I could come on to those enhanced victims and the work that's done by our Lighthouse team. So, for officers and investigators, there's the initial communication and information sharing they do with victims. So their training will provide them with the ability to give clear information about what's going to happen next with the case, what the rights of the victim are, how often the victim would like to be contacted, for instance, and by what method, and also the possible outcomes of the investigation. So the first bit is giving information clearly at that first point. Then there is their own responsibilities to comply with the victim's code of practice, to meet those requirements on updates, etc. I talked about a trauma-informed approach. So increasingly, we're trying to work with officers and investigators to recognise trauma and to make sure that the communication and the contact is being done in a way that avoids that re-traumatisation, is cognizant of it. There can be as well the responsibility of making referrals. So, it may be that first initial officer or the investigating officer that recognises the need. There needs to be a referral to a specialist support service or to the Lighthouse team. And then there's that ongoing engagement throughout the investigation, helping people navigate at every point. So that's the expectation from the investigator, if you like, the officer in the case. But then we have our specialists in our Lighthouse team, and we separate here things pre-charge and post-charge. So before a decision has been made that a case is going to court, the Lighthouse team's focus is on enhanced victims, so the ones I've talked about, serious crime, etc. What they will do is, once a victim is identified to Lighthouse, they'll do a victim needs assessment, and that's done by a victim and witness care officer, so a specialist, and it contacts them to discuss what their specific needs are. And what can then happen is a tailored support plan, which covers things like emotional support and help. And this is where the multi-agency approach of specialist support services that you've commissioned can come in to be part of that support plan to meet the needs of that individual victim. But it also can include things like safety planning. If a victim is persistently targeted, a victim of domestic abuse is intimidated, there may be need for extra things that we need to do. That victim and witness care officer with an enhanced victim will also stay with them the course. So there'll be a single point of contact, working hand in hand with the officer, the investigating officer. So, but there will be that single point throughout the investigations, right through to court proceedings. Now, for all victims where a case is going to court, Lighthouse will step in there as well to make sure that victims understand what the court process is going to be like. So that could be pre-visits, liaison with the Crown Prosecution Service, ensuring that victims are kept up to date with things like court dates, trial dates, sentencing. And with that backlog in the criminal justice system, adjournments happen a lot.
Yeah.
So there can be lots of toing and froing, and that victim and witness care officers help for all victims going through that process is invaluable. And for some victims, there can be a wish for contact post-trial as well. So where cases, and people have gone to prison, contact with the probation service and the prison service and making sure that continues as well. So we have a core level of service, if you like, but then we have an enhanced level of service, both pre-charge for enhanced victims, but also for all victims who are going to court.
Thank you, Sarah. And you talked about this to some extent, obviously in the answer, particularly just now, but it's about adapting the service to meet the needs of victims of crime. And this is particularly because some groups can be disproportionately affected about this, can be disproportionately affected. And as with all disproportionality,
that's something called the Bragg risk assessment tool. Bragg stands for blue, which is a standard risk, or red, high risk, amber, medium risk, and green, low risk. And that enables them to assess in a structured way and categorise victims based on their needs, on their vulnerability, through the investigation, but through the whole criminal justice system. And the questions in that assessment will explore things like vulnerability, repeat victimisation, communication needs, emotional, psychological needs as well, but also help to understand intersectional factors that may increase a victim's risk of harm, but also perhaps affect how they engage with services, whether it's more difficult or not. So as you say, a young woman from a minority ethnic background who's been a victim of hate crime may experience that crime in a very different way than a male victim of burglary who was not at the premises at the time that it happened. So that first Bragg risk assessment will help set forward how we support that victim according to their needs throughout the process. So, for instance, a communication need might signpost that we need to get the use of interpreters or the use of alternative formats like Braille. It might also identify that there's a gender-specific need for particular cases. So sexual violence, a victim may want someone of the same gender. If there's a mental health or learning disability, it may be that the investigator needs to work alongside colleagues from health or social care to ensure that the communication needs are right. But what the Bragg risk assessment will also do is identify immediately who are enhanced victims and need the support of the Lighthouse team, who then go through that much more detailed needs assessment that I've talked about, which will help identify and any particular needs, again, targeting intersectionality. Now, I talked about the victim and witness care officers having a year's worth of training when they started, so they have a really good understanding of those multiple layers of difference or disadvantage that can affect a victim's ability to engage with the process. So there may be a disabled victim, domestic abuse, they may need housing support, mental health care, court assistance, and all of that simultaneously. And the victim and witness care officer will have the specialism and the knowledge and the access to the services through their care plan to be able to deal with that. Additionally, we do work on a more generic basis with community-based organisations or specialist charities to look at how we can improve services for victims who have those multiple levels of difference or disadvantage. So we'll work with SORI, for instance, Stand Against Racism, and we'll work with NextLink, who are a commission service. We might work with our own race community network that we've developed through our Race Matters work, or our independent advisory groups that support geographically, but different groups as well. So the Women's IAG, for instance. And what we'll try to do is try to co-produce solutions so that our service delivery can be reflective of the needs of those victim groups on a more generic basis. And we'll also try, and constantly, as we started discussing, getting community feedback through some of those forums as well to get some sense of how we are doing, and that can feed back into that learning loop for us. So we recognise that, you know, victimisation isn't experienced by everyone the same. It's not equal. And so, as you said, we're trying to make our services as adaptable, as culturally competent, I think, and as inclusive as possible, because all victims are different.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked in, you know, in your response just then and earlier, talking about other sort of assessment, systemic approaches, looking at how, you know, taking a sort of helicopter view, if you like, of how effective the service is, that measurement, some of the data around that. Yeah. There's also the individual cases that, you know, where victims don't feel they've had the right response, and it would be useful, I think, for you to talk through, right, okay, where individuals are unsatisfied with how the police have responded to them. What is the consequence then? Yeah,
so, well, it depends what the level of dissatisfaction is, and it also, critically, depends on what the victim wants from that interaction. So, you know, if the level of victim service is so lacking, we may be in the realms of the police misconduct regime, but it may well be that it's about learning for an individual officer. It might be learning for the organisation and a process. The system needs to change, training needs to change, and it may well be that that victim, actually part of what they want is their voice to be heard. So some victims have been very charitably, have given their time. So I've given in that example about our domestic abuse matters training, to use their experience to be captured so that we can improve our service, and the sense of I'm making it better for other victims coming forward. So, you know, we do our best to get it right every time, but if we don't get it right, there are a range of different mechanisms, ranging from organisational learning to individual learning, right up to the police misconduct and complaints regime, so that that victim feels that their experience has been heard, it's been seen, it's been acknowledged, and we've done something about it. And on occasions, if there is a room to say sorry, for sorry to be said, including by me, and that's something that I take particular care to do. So there are victims that I have met and taken time to listen to what's happened to them, to make personal commitments and follow through that we've done something about it. But critically, it's also important for them to hear me to say sorry. You know, and you know that it, you know, in cases there has been civil recompense as well.
Thank you, Sarah. We never have enough time for police question time, so this is a topic of conversation that in the different forums that you and I meet in the scrutiny role and the commissioning role that I have, that victims will always be part of that conversation, and their experience really matters in terms of that service delivery, either through commission services or obviously through the response of police in those scenarios. So thank you again for joining me for PQT. And this then is a thank you to you at home for joining us, and I hope you found this an interesting session and an informative one. So also thank you to those of you that have sent questions in. It is always welcome to receive those questions and to give me a chance to put them to the Chief Constable, Sarah Crewe. We will indeed be raising, having another PQT next month. It will be on the 16th of April, so please send in your questions for that PQT then, and also we always store the questions up as well to be used in future. So if you want to find details about that, they are on my website and through my social media channels as well. The website is Avon and Somerset pcc.gov.uk. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.